to the NCRCRD webinar for November, Latino Farmers in the Midwest Practices and Challenges. And I think if you've been joining us in our webinars, you'll see that we've had a range of issues that I think are super interesting that are going on across the North Central region and really nationally. So I'm excited to hear what our presenters have to say. Let me introduce our presenters. We've got Corinne Valdivia. Of course, I put your title here. Corinne Valdivia, the D. Howard Doane Professor of Agricultural and Applied Economics, the Division of Applied Social Sciences, the College of Agriculture, Food and Natural Resources at the University of Missouri, and the interim co-director of Cambio Center at Missouri University, which they do great work in that center as well. So if you don't know about it, please Google and find all the great things that they do. Stephen Janetta, Associate Dean at Center for Community Vitality, University of Minnesota Extension. And Ruben Martinez, Professor and Director of Julian Zamora Research Institute, Michigan State University. So a great representation of the North Central region and the things that we can be doing together, which we always are trying to promote. And so with that, I'll turn it over to you all.
Thank you, Maria. So this is a project that started in 2016. We received a grant from NIFA to explore Latino agriculture entrepreneurship. Essentially, what we were interested in doing was looking at Latino farmers and how they're developing as farmers, how they're developing as entrepreneurs, and the relationships that they have with the farm support systems and the institutions that support farmers. Other work that we've done include, kind of made us think that, there's some challenges, particularly as it relates to connecting these farmers with the resources that they need in order to be able to grow as farmers, but also begin to better access markets and grow their operations. And so part of what we did was Ruben and I in Michigan, and Corinne and I was in Missouri at the time, and Jan and Neil Flora in Iowa. We started working on looking at, some of the farming communities are a little bit different there in each of those three states. In Missouri, we had a lot of new entry farmers that had just started since the mid-90s, which was when we really started to see a Latino diaspora in Missouri. In Michigan, it's older, and some of the farmers have been in farming longer. And then in Iowa, we were looking less at farmers and more at folks that wanted to get into farming. There were some differences in terms of how it looks there than it did in either Missouri or Michigan. And so what we wanted to do this afternoon is, we're not really going to talk about the Iowa work. Neither Jan or Neil are able to join us today, but we're going to really kind of explore part of our research with in Michigan and in Missouri. We ended up doing it in a number of different ways. We wanted to connect with farmers, Latino farmers, so we did focus groups and household interviews. And Ruben is going to talk a little bit about what they learned about from that in Michigan. And then we also did interviews and mostly focus groups with resource providers as well, to kind of get a sense of what they were doing in terms of how they were reaching out to Latino farmers and the kinds of resources they were supporting them with. And then the last component then was a survey, which we did with farmers in Missouri, farmers in Michigan, and then Latinos that were interested in entry into farming in Iowa. And so we'll talk a little. Corinne's going to talk a little bit more about the work we did on the surveys, what we learned in Missouri, as well as some things we've done across Michigan and Missouri. And then coming out of that, our goal was to create some resources to help resource providers and the Latino farmers better connect to each other. And I'll talk a little bit about that towards the end. So who are these Latino farmers? In some of the work that we've been doing, their motivations, a lot of the farmers are motivated because it's something they want to do. There's a number of the farmers I've interviewed and others have seen that they're really kind of thinking about land as a way of acquiring wealth. And same with some of their livestock. One farmer we interviewed, and he was interested in cattle, and he wasn't going to sell a cow until he had 40. It wasn't so much that there was a magic number for him, but that was where he felt like he was going to be. And it was really more as a sign of his own wealth and assets that he was shooting for before he really kind of thought about it as a revenue source. And then they're part of the farmland transition, which is an interesting time right now in farming because there aren't very many people going into agriculture right now, but there are lots of Latino farmers entering into that field. They're typically pretty small operations. The ones we saw in Missouri and were really quite small. We're seeing small, 20 to 40, 45 acres, and some of those are 5-acre plots spread in 2 or 3 different parts of a county or across a couple of counties. In Michigan, they were a little bigger. And then there's cultural differences between these farming populations. A number of the farmers that we were working with, and they have an aversion to credit, which puts them at a disadvantage in terms of growing their businesses. And then they're also not really all that connected or engaged in the government support programs, which also puts them at a disadvantage when thinking about growing their enterprises. And then there's just not that many producer networks or cooperatives or other kinds of things that they're becoming part of or joining, that they can access resources and knowledge that way. And so when we look at the last farm census, you can see there really hasn't been there's been some falling back in terms of both the number of farmers and the amount of land being farmed in the Midwest. We've seen some declines in acreage and as well as in the number of farmers. Then when we look a little bit at the Latino farmers, we see kind of the opposite happening across the region, where we see quite a few new farmers getting into farming, and the amount of land that they're farming is growing. The numbers are still quite small, and they don't have as many assets as most farmers, which we'll get into in our presentation a little bit later. And then even when you look at multiple operators on a farm, we still see some growth there. These comparisons aren't real easy to make right now because they changed the definition of an operator from 3 per farm and 4 to farm. So the change might actually be a little exaggerated there, but you still see that some significant growth in the amount of land that they're farming. So in our model, we're trying to think about how we approach our work with these farmers, and we developed what we call the Livelihood Matrix for farmers. So what we're really trying to understand is the different types of farmers that are in the Latino community. We divided them up into 4 groups: a lifestyle farmer, who's pretty much farming is not their primary occupation. And then the retirement lifestyle farmer, which is a farmer that's accumulating resources to support themselves a little bit in their retirement. And so those farmers tend to be less market oriented. They're not necessarily as integrated into that, and they're thinking about farming might often be towards providing food for friends and family or local markets. Then the other side is this more the part-time farmer with commercial-oriented operation that hopes to become or plans to become a full-time farmer, or seeing it as becoming a significant component of their income strategy. And then the last is a full-time farmer, full-time commercial farmer. And these folks we see as higher market integration through through their farming. And so when we're talking about, well, how do we operationalize this? We're using a community capitals framework for that. And these are some of the ways we're operationalizing the concepts. You know, when we're thinking about social capital, it's a network of farmers and maybe some of the networks that they need to belong to. Human capital is really kind of focused on their experiences and educational capacity. Financial capital is what extent to which they raise capital for investing in their farming. Access to land for natural capital. Political capital is how connected they are in their communities. And then build capital is the value of their assets of the farming enterprise and their ability to access and utilize technology. Cultural capital, we were looking at things like their acculturation, both within their community, how are they acculturating in their community, but also how are they acculturating in the field of farming. And Corinne will talk a little bit more about that. And then the community climate. Does the climate stifle integration or participation, or does it allow for it? So Corinne's going to take the next part and talk a little bit about strategies of farming and pathways in Missouri and in Michigan. Corinne?
Yeah, good afternoon. What I'm going to talk about is data that comes from the surveys that we did in Michigan and in Missouri, and basically looking at the livelihood strategies and how different farmers are in the regions, depending on the level of income that they're getting from agriculture, as well as their objectives in life. Next. Steve? So when we're looking at the profiles of Latinos out of the data that we were able to gather, it took a while actually to get access to people that were willing to participate in these contexts. Takes some time, especially because of the fact that the Latino farmers are not only farmers, but they're working all the time. So in order to be able to access them, it does take investment and trust in their willingness to participate. And so we were able to gather enough data to do some analysis. And within those, we classify them first just to understand their livelihoods into 4 groups. The first group was the group of farmers that had agriculture as a primary economic activity. A second group that was integrating to market and had sales between 5,000 and 10,000. Group 3 that had sales of less than 5,000, and then group 4 were engaged in buying land, but were not participating in the markets at the time. Next. And so in group 1, some of the characteristics of the farmers related to their decisions for reasons to enter farming, such as thinking of farming as a way to earn money, escape from a tedious job, produce healthier organic foods with no chemicals. That was important to many of the farmers that we actually interviewed, and a cut in household food expenses. So in this group, these were some of the top goals, the reason why they were entering farming. Increased revenue was important, and then as well as generate income for retirement. These were farmers with an average of 49 years of age, and they engaged in the economic enterprise, selling crops around 10,000, selling livestock over 100,000, and had been investing in the farming around $130,000. Group 2 were engaged in the practice of farming. Again, some of the top 4 goals for them were expand the farm operation as they were entering. They were younger as well. They were around 45. They were wanting to increase revenues, purchase new equipment, and generate income during retirement. So engaging in farming as an economic activity. One of the things that we are focusing on is how farmers enter farming. And so we use two concepts: the concept of field of farming, meaning how well do farmers relate to the institutions in traditional farming in the US, and the habitus or values, the reasons why. So that's why we talk about these goals and what's driving their decisions. What we find also is that the level of acculturation, meaning how well they speak English, how well they use the media, how well they relate in English, has also an impact on how well you can relate in that field of farming. And so the acculturation index goes all the way to 4. And in this particular group, they were acculturated in English. Again, their sales were not as large, but it's specifically focusing on livestock for this category, but also heavily involving in farming. The next slide, please. In group 3, again, a smaller level of income from agriculture. The top reasons: still increasing revenue, generating income for retirement were important in this group. And they were younger as well. And their level of acculturation was lower than the second and the first group. They were basically doing some sales of livestock and sales of some crops, and they were investing in farming. And the last group was those that were engaged in farming for other reasons. And basically, one of the things that was important for this group was to build on assets so that they could pass the farm to the next generation. They were still younger in that group of the 40s with an acculturation index that was lower than the other groups. Next. One of the things that we also needed to understand by all these groups that I just mentioned is how well they trusted the institutions and the practice of farming. And so group 1, which is the more invested, if you look at the scale from 1 to 4, was really well connected and trusted the organizations that are traditional, like NRCS, FSA, Soil, Water, and Conservation, Department of Agriculture, and especially University Extension. And if you look at University Extension, that's a constant across all these 4 groups. So they have a good rapport or relationship to that particular institution in farming. In group 2 and 3 also have, especially group 2, has also these high level of trust of the institutions. In 3, there is a process, and you see it because they're entering farming, that's still starting to build. But group 4 only relates to University Extension. Next. So we also tried using the data from Michigan and Missouri. We did some cluster analysis trying to understand factors that would separate the groups into different motives for being in farming. Next. And in order to do that, again, and going back to the idea of the practice of farming, looking at the habitus and the values, we wanted to understand, we used variables that capture how important agriculture was in their livelihoods, their human capital and acculturation, their values of farming, revenues, their ability to market, different ways of marketing strategies, and their capital investments. Next. These are some of the characteristics of the data in terms of averages between Missouri, 54 farmers, and Michigan, 70 farmers at a time. And what you see is that in average, the Michigan farmers are a little bit older. They have similar levels of education and acculturation in English. So in average in Missouri, it's around 2.3 out of 4, and in Michigan was 2 out of 4, while their Spanish acculturation is very high, meaning that they mostly relate still to the media and use the language and in Spanish. Their crop sales were very different, very high in Michigan, while livestock sales were higher in Missouri. And their investments in agriculture were higher in the case of Michigan, in the case of Missouri. Next, please. The variables that we use for the cluster analysis, as I mentioned, had to do with revenue, investments, scale of being a good farmer and what it means in terms of the environment and the way you practice farming. Also, how do you sell your products if you're selling locally or you're selling to other markets? Their acculturation in English and Spanish, as well as the years in farming and if the spouse is involved or not in farming. Next. From the cluster analysis, we find 4 differentiated groups. And as you see across are the clusters, and the columns show you the values for those variables that went into cluster analysis. And some of the most important parts here are to highlight that cluster 1 is the one more invested in agriculture. Cluster 2 is the one that's different from the other groups because of their lower investments in agriculture. Cluster 4 has the lowest level of acculturation in lowest level of acculturation in English. And cluster 4 has the higher level of participation in some of the markets as well. Next, to look at the characteristics in terms of the distribution of the clusters as well. What you see is that in the cluster 1, actually a couple is engaged in farming, which sets it apart from the other 3 groups. And these are, cluster 1 is also the group that has been more years in farming as opposed to the other groups, though cluster 3 is also has more than 10 years as well. Just to look at the distribution of the sample, state was not used as a variable in cluster analysis, but you can see that cluster 1 has a significant amount of farmers, both from Michigan and Missouri, and cluster 4 as well in terms of Missouri. Next. So basically, in the main takeaways in this case are that the strategies, what we're finding is that are very different, and that acculturation processes are important. The higher the level of acculturation, the better the ability also to relate to the mainstream institutions. Cluster 1, again, as mentioned, has a long time in farming, had good representation of Michigan and Missouri farmers, with levels of sales of 39,000 and investments around 69. Cluster 2, most farmers are from Michigan. They are in the 2 to 10 years of farming with investments around $14,000, and also are the lowest in terms of their Spanish acculturation. Cluster 3 has farmers that have more than 10 years in farming, with investments of $25,000 and the lowest Anglo acculturation, meaning their lower skills to communicate in English. And cluster 4 was mostly from farmers with Missouri who are mostly building assets. So there is a high level of investments in ag, and also have a high scale in terms of being a good farmer. Next. I think, Ruben, I gave you enough time.
Buenas tardes, everybody. Welcome. Great to have you at our session. Presentation today is going to be mostly on qualitative aspects, and we will be focusing particularly on the differences of perceptions between producers and service providers. Next. So what we have here, this is what we did here in Michigan. We conducted 4 focus groups, 2 with producers, 2 with service providers. Each group had 5 to 8 persons per group. We also conducted 10 individual producer interviews, or what Corinne referred to as household interviews. And then we had 70 survey respondents. All of those were conducted by an administered process. That is, the person who was out in the field working through the instrument with people. So real quickly, just some demographics in terms of who these folks were. Of the 70, 63 were men, 7 were women. The age distribution here, you can see that the modal category is between 55 and 64, which was evident in the previous presentation. The overwhelming majority were married, and just 9 were either partnered, widowed, or single. And a couple of them were living here, and the spouse was living in their country of origin. Where did they come from? I think in this case, what we have is overwhelmingly immigrants from Mexico. We had a couple who were born in Cuba, and a couple who were native born here in the United States. 23 were naturalized US citizens, 33 permanent legal residents. 1 had another type of immigration status, and 13 declined to answer that particular question. In terms of length of residence here in the state, 1 had just arrived, was here was basically from 1 to 3 years, 4 were from 4 to 7 years, and 63 had more than 8 years. 2, probably the 2 native born ones, had lived here all of their lives. In terms of part-time, full-time farmers, I think what we're going to find is a lot of overlap between what's going on in Missouri and also what's going on here in Michigan. But 23 of the 70 were full-time farmers, 46 were part-time. 1 did not answer that. In terms of years of farming, 15 had 2 to 5 years, 21 had 6 to 10 years, and almost the majority, 48%, nearly half of them, had more than 10 years experience. In terms of the acreage, we will see that the modal categories are 5 to 9 acres and to 19 acres. A lot of these were blueberry farmers, so it doesn't take a whole lot of acreage to be a producer in that sector of the industry. Next, please. Type of ownership, the overwhelming majority were single family or sole owners. 10 of them were in some sort of family partnership, and 1 of them was an operator. 2 said that they were in some other kind of arrangement, could be leasing or something like that. The primary activity for these farmers, only 19 said that farming was their primary activity. 51 said that they were doing something else. What we tended to find is that they tended to have they will either worked off the farm or had some other business on the side going for them. In terms of previous farming experience, we've seen that they did have it, and 58 of them said yes. Interestingly enough, 12 of them said that they did not have any experience in that arena. So it's a kind of a steep slope learning curve here for them. Had they gotten any government assistance in the last 10 years? Only 10 of them said that they had. 58 of them said they had not. 3 of them did not indicate. In terms of the household situation, was the spouse a full-time farmer? 20 of them said yes. 48 of them said no. And then in terms of managing the farm with the person not part of the household, 6 of them said yes, and 63 said no, which is consistent with the pattern that we've seen up above. In terms of education, the modal category was less than 9th grade. And then the next is 9th to 12th grade, but no diploma. We only had 8 who had graduated from high school, and some had some college. In some other studies that I've done, particularly with Latinos and business activities, we find that education is one of the most significant factors in the success of the business. So I think this is a critical factor to keep in mind when we look at farmers in agriculture. Next. So here's what you've been waiting for. I know that. The results from the focus groups. And so you see we have here in table 3, 6 categories: reasons for becoming a producer, economic importance of farming, goals as an agricultural producer, the barriers experienced, the areas of planning and areas of difficulty. Reasons for becoming a farmer, very similar to what was going on over in Missouri. And that is, they want to have generational continuity. They like it as a lifestyle. They engage in family activities, and they particularly see it as a way of socializing the young into doing some work. It's a fallback position due to limited human capital. They are guided by farming values, and some of them just want to be their own bosses, if you will. In terms of economic importance, it's the development of that work ethic that I mentioned. It's a livelihood strategy. They want financial security. It's a source of employment, and they want to develop their agricultural skills. In terms of the goals, they want to build human capital. They want to have continuity in agricultural production. They want to develop agricultural expertise, and they want to develop their market orientation. In terms of barriers, particularly in blueberries, the market prices have not been very good, so there's a tendency to express concern about that. Uncertainty is a critical feature of all farming, but in this case, price uncertainty, particularly in blueberries, was of great concern. Shortage of working capital, shortage of workers. That shortage was just beginning to occur, and worsened as the chilly climate intensified over the last 5-6 years. There was a low return on investment. They had difficulty controlling pests, and this particularly in blueberries, and they found production costs to be relatively high. Areas of planning, they wanted to talk about ad hoc production planning, expanding or changing something, waiting for the opportunity to buy. Here, they there's a tendency here to wait instead of really having it as a goal and pursuing it proactively. So that's I think a limitation. They want to, their position is to take advantage of emergent opportunities, but they're not really creating those opportunities. And they don't always consider long-term investments. Areas of difficulty that we found was record keeping. They're not integrated into the agricultural industry very well. In fact, despite Latinos being the second largest population in the country, they're the least non-connected to the core institutions of our society. And if we take that as an axiom, you can just deduce that that will be occurring as well in agriculture. Payment methods are a concern, securing markets, farm worker issues. Here we have basically labor issues, accessing government support and accessing production knowledge, and pest control are some of the difficulties that they experienced. Next. Now we take a look at service providers. We have 3 major categories: working with Latino farmers, challenges of service providers that they experience in working with Latinos, and perceived Latino farmer challenges. So the first one on the left column, working with Latino farmers, they recognize that they have to build trust. This is a matter of concern, I think, on a couple of levels. One, there's what I would call a culture clash. That is, the Latino culture is what we call a personalistic culture. You have to get to know the person before you get down to business. This is not what you do in what I would call Western culture, of which American culture is an exemplary feature of. So that needs to happen. They recognize that there's a time investment that goes with it. The cultural differences are important, and particularly with regard to immigrants who may be a little bit shy, if you will, shy in quotes. Language barriers that's been discussed, barriers to outreach, willing to adapt to changes, and to use other Latinos and community partners as brokers. So here they're going to restaurants and trying to build connections to that community, those communities, and going to churches and so on. It's a good effort. Some of you might remember that a few years ago I conducted a survey of the extension educators and how they were able to serve Latino producers and whether they had the resources and so on. And about 2/3 to 3/4 across the board basically said that it was not a priority for their units, that they did not have the support needed to do it, and that they did not have the cultural competency frequently to do it. So some of the challenges they see is part of what I'm talking about in terms of personalistic relationships. Viewing outreach is relational. They have to get out there and meet people. I know in one of the focus groups with the service providers, one person said, well, we serve everyone that comes in through the door. But that's not really a perspective that understands that you have to reach out to farmers to get to know them, and then they will come in through the door. There's frustration with language barriers. There's a lack of Spanish language materials. There's a concern about not understanding Latino culture, and they have concerns about really having the ability to provide services and maintaining sustained communications with these farmers. What they perceive in terms of Latino farmer challenges is a lack of planning. They don't understand the government programs. They don't understand food safety. They have trouble accessing financial capital. They have credit history problems. I was just reading recently that someone said that no credit history is better than a bad credit history. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. And of course, language barriers. They need to do better record keeping and a little better habitat management and having that sort of broader holistic perspective. Next, please. Next slide, please. Hello, it's me calling from Mars.
Sorry, Ruben, it seems to be stuck. There we go.
Okay, well, it must have been that energy from Mars that made it, that kicked it back in. So let's see, in terms of needs, we've already talked about the record keeping and so forth. There are some organizational barriers that we've also talked a little bit about. Here, I'll just highlight that there need to be some programs for Latinas, and that there's, from the point of view of service providers, there's a lack of funds for outreach, which has to do with the limited resources for working with this particular group. And what would be helpful to be more effective is a more continuity of programs and understanding Latino culture, collaboration across the agencies, which I think would take them to scale, tailoring entrepreneurship programs for this particular groups, developing partnerships with the community and outreaching to the community and developing ties there, and viewing farmers as customers, although I would say probably viewing them as clients would be more conducive to the kind of relationship that needs to be developed here. Again, next slide. So what do we have? You know, in terms of Latino farmer and farm characteristics, I think what's happening in Missouri and in Michigan has a lot of serious overlap. They have various reasons for farming. We've seen the concern for intergenerational continuity, lifestyle, working with family, growing assets, creating wealth for future generations. The farms tend to be family-run operations. They're relatively small, averaging between 20 and 45 acres. Some of the challenges they experience, well, relatively low levels of education. As I mentioned, education is critical in navigating our markets. Discrimination and racism still persists out there. There are language barriers, cultural differences with agencies, that person orientation versus task orientation, lack of capacity of agencies to serve them, and limited integration into the agricultural industry. They have limited agriculture and business experience, lack of required certifications in many cases, limited understanding of risk management approaches, and limited access to capital, land, and labor. So in terms of the big picture, what we find is that these are very hardworking entrepreneurs, budding entrepreneurs, I should say, but they're struggling. They're limited in terms of the integration into the larger communities in which they live. They have limited integration into the industry. They tend not to be members of co-ops, associations, and so on. So they're kind of struggling out there on their own, oftentimes just getting information from other farmers and family. There are gaps in the service delivery systems that exist out there. There's a lack of capability on both sides. Clearly, farmers need to develop the knowledge and skills to be meeting some of the compliance and regulatory demands of the industry, and the service providers need to develop capability to be able to serve them. These are the cultural differences that I've pointed to, and there are also structural issues, particularly some of these agencies really just having these farmers categorized as a low priority. One more. Okay, so some of the areas that need attention is knowledge. I think, again, on both sides, financial access, legal regulatory knowledge, and relationship building. We need to help these farmers develop knowledge of the administrative and business components of their operations. And they need to expand their relationships between the family and friends. They need to increase understanding of government programs and eligibility requirements. And service providers need to close the gaps that they have relative to these communities and the farmers in these communities, particularly Latino farmers. And I think that's it. That should be the last slide for me, Steve.
All right. Thanks, Ruben. So last thing we want to talk about is just a few minutes about, what we ended up developing coming out of this. Our intent was to develop what we called an agriculture entrepreneurship readiness scale, which as we got into it, realized wasn't really what was needed. And so we created kind of a suite of assessment and tools that we thought could really kind of help address some of the basic issues that we saw popping up in both our survey work and in the interviews and focus groups. So what we ended up developing were some readiness tools that we talk about an assessment tool, which was two parts. The first part is really focused on helping the resource provider get to know the farmer a little bit better and begin to build some trust. And then the second piece is really to do some work getting to assessing the operation itself. And then the next one is really an assessment for the resource provider in terms of thinking about what they need to do and how they can prepare themselves for working with these farmers. And then the last was some tips for working with Latino farmers that came out of our webinar series with some of the providers. They wanted a resource like that. So Ruben put together one page sort of tip sheet for them in terms of working with farmers. And then our plan was to spend some time working with resource providers around our states to pilot some of these things and help them work with some of these farmers. But we got hit by the pandemic, and that wasn't really possible within the time frame of the grant. And so we ended up convening them over a series of webinars where in the first one, we just kind of profiled what we were learning about the farmers in Michigan and in Missouri, and then the farm workers in Iowa. And then the second one, we took a deeper dive into the data, kind of really exploring some of the things that Corinne and Ruben shared here this afternoon. And then the last one, we really kind of explored some of these tools and got their feedback on them. And so, for instance, like the tips for working with Latinos was something that came out of that, as well as some changes they thought would be useful in some of the other tools that we developed. I just kind of show you the first one. This is really the one that they seem actually most excited about, was really kind of thinking about something that they could use to kind of introduce themselves to the farmers and begin to understand what the farmers were doing, but also begin to build some trust there. One of the things we were seeing particularly in our focus groups, was that a lot of the providers didn't think about the Latino farmers as farmers. They thought them as doing things as a hobby, but they didn't really think of them as a farmer in the way they think of some of their other clients. And part of that is they don't really understand that well the goals of these farmers. They don't understand some of the cultural differences, and they just don't really have much for relationships. And so this was really kind of to help them begin to start to kind of explore each other before they go in and do an operational profile or things like that with the farmers. And so then the second half of that is more of a farm assessment profile where they're looking at their operation, they're looking at their farm goals, the characteristics of the farmer itself, comfort with English, are they joining associations and those kinds of things, and then exploring some of their assets and training needs. This project self-assessment form was really kind of a way for them to some questions we wanted them to think through before they started engaging with the farmer, and then a little bit afterwards too. It's things like what can they do to build trust with the farmer they're about to go visit with? What programs might they have that they think could be useful to the farmer? And then afterwards, what strengths did they see in the farmer, would-be farmer? And that's partly to address this idea of their negative concepts of Latino farmers as farmers. What are the programs they're using or interested in using? What surprised them, which is really more about getting a sense of who they are as farmers. And then different ways they can relate to them, different resources they might have, how they might make changes in some of their programs in order to better meet these needs. And then thinking about their own needs. What do they need what kind of training do they need if they better want to serve these farmers? And that was pretty much our presentation for today. I know Jan Flora joined, so if anybody has questions or comments and wants to find out a little bit more about what we did in Iowa, I'm sure Jan would be interested in sharing some of that. Any kind of questions or comments from us? We tried to save about 15 minutes or so for some discussion.
So right on target. Any questions, anyone? Oh, there's a question in the chat. If you want, I can read it for you so you don't have to keep wondering about the chat. But Melinda Gerismer says, wonderful project. Did you measure satisfaction levels among farmers?
I'm sorry, Maria, I didn't hear the question.
The question is, did you measure satisfaction levels among farmers?
And I can elaborate a little bit if that helps,
Sure.
because that's kind of broad. I just wondered if you had measured satisfaction with their current work. So since they've switched to farming, has it been a satisfying endeavor for them? Did that come up at all in the focus group discussion?
That did not come up in those discussions.
Yeah.
Not in mine.
Okay, that was interesting to me. And then one other real quick question was, I'm working on programming in terms of, do we deploy Spanish language programming, or do we continue to deploy programs in English and expect our Latino audiences to have the cognitive academic language proficiency to be able to handle those? Or do we start to do more Spanish language training program, which is kind of what I'm advocating for? And I wondered if any of that came up in the focus group in terms of would Spanish language training programs be beneficial, and in what areas would you be targeting those? And just wondered if that had come up at all.
We've been doing some coursework with these farmers on holistic farm management. We do it in a bilingual format. So people are able to, the instructors are able to switch from Spanish to English and back and forth. So I would say that it's not either or, that it has to be bilingual.
Okay, wonderful. And
I would add to that, though, I think it's also, language is important because the building relationships is important, and it's hard to do if there isn't some at least effort in terms of communicating with the farmers in the languages that they're comfortable in.
okay,
And I should add also something that we found in when we talk about acculturation and the culture of the people that the farmers in this particular case has to do with the fact that they have time maybe on Saturday afternoon and Sunday, not during the week, because they are full-time working and then working on the farm. And so figuring out how the institutions can adjust to serving these minority groups is really important.
Related to that too is for the Latino farmers, and mostly in pretty rural areas, there aren't very many good quality adult ed language programs for them. They're wanting to learn English. And that's kind of a barrier as well.
That's
I see that.
exactly the area of my interest. So I appreciate
Mhm.
you
Okay.
addressing that. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Monique. I see that Dr. Harris had his hand up.
I do, and part of the question was answered, but certainly, Steve, Ruben, and Corinne, thank you for the presentation. It was very interesting. I'd like to know as well, did you draw any distinction between entrepreneurship and agribusiness skills? And if you did draw a distinction in it, did you see where the entrepreneur had some, there was something about the entrepreneur that allowed them to overcome some of the barriers that some other businesses, other business people might encounter? So kind of a two-part question. Did you draw any distinctions between an entrepreneur and a business professional? And if you did, is there anything about the entrepreneur that would allow them to overcome any barriers that perhaps maybe normal business folks are faced with?
We didn't do the distinction between entrepreneurship and being a business owner, with the entrepreneur being someone who has actually transformed something in the industry. I think what we have here are persons who are simply trying to become more integrated and become more successful, but not necessarily transforming any of the practices that exist in the industry at this point.
And it also depends on how you define entrepreneur, right? So if you're thinking about people that are sensing and looking for opportunities and trying to develop alternative ways of doing things, you do find that in the Latinos, especially we've seen those here in Missouri, and trying to develop maybe some alternative crops that actually serve the Latino restaurants because of the nature of the chilies that they prefer, or figuring out organic farming and finding out ways to actually commercialize their organic products, for example. So again, it depends on the definition of entrepreneurship. In terms of agribusiness as such, there are some in our sample, if you were thinking about operations that are fully invested in agriculture, but not necessarily, we didn't ask the questions that way as you're posing them.
Now, we did ask questions about goals. We asked questions about values. We had questions about what constituted a good farmer, some of those kinds of things. So we could get into some aspects of that, but we didn't do it directly.
So higher level of production or more environmental practices, leaving the land as you found it, or things like that. Those were part of the value scales that we did use.
Great. I don't know if you're all reading the chat, but I can read you the questions as they go along. Jay Harmon had a question that says, was there any appreciable, I can't say that word, difference seen in Iowa versus what was seen in Missouri and Michigan?
We didn't interview, there weren't very many farmers in Iowa that were included on our sample. It was mostly farm workers. So it was a little bit different kind of work there. Jan probably could answer that question the best if he's still on.
Steve, could you stop the share just so that we can see others?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I can do that.
Look at all those lovely faces.
Hi, Jan.
Hi. Could you repeat the question?
Sure. Somebody was asking if there were major differences between I guess you did do farm workers in Iowa, so there may be differences, but the Iowa sample versus Missouri and Michigan.
One of the things that I noticed with respect to the farm worker sample is that they were, as you might expect, were quite a bit younger. They were about 10 years younger than either the Missouri or Michigan farmers. So they had the opportunity to, they still had time to become farmers. And one of the questions that we asked of the farm workers, and one of the reasons that we included farm workers in the overall study, was to find out if they would like to be farmers and if they had the opportunity to become farmers. And so we asked them if they would like to operate a farm, and the majority said yes, they would. And then we asked them, do you expect to be farming in 5 years? And it was a bit surprising, but still about 40% of them said yes, I expect to be farming in 5 years. And then we asked who had access to farmland. And that proportion was down below 10%. And but it was kind of amazing. It seemed like those folks were the category 4 that Corinne introduced, which were the ones who didn't have sales but were acquiring land. And Sioux County in Northwest Iowa, where we did the study, is the most has the largest number or share of farm workers in the entire state. And those, well, in general, a friend of ours who also worked on this project from Argentina studied farm workers, Anglo farm workers in central Iowa. And he found that that often farm workers had a pathway to becoming farmers, and the employer that they worked for would lend them some land or provide them with some livestock that they could begin building some equity in. And we found that that was pretty unusual. There were only a couple of farm workers who had that kind of opportunity in Northwest Iowa. So the desire is there, but the pathway is still a bit unclear. And of course, it also has the fact that they're younger and are working as farm workers means a lot of them are undocumented. And we sort of estimated that about 40% of them were undocumented, which makes it difficult for them to get to buy land and have the security that they need to move toward being a farmer. Sorry to take so long on the question.
No problem. There's another question by Alicia Herzog that says, it's a pretty long question, but basically asking about what are the most effective ways that extension educators could work with this population, meaning Latino farmers, if they're, if they're not Spanish speakers, right? So they've thought about getting programming translated, but then how do you do that technical assistance in one-on-one per se that we do a lot in extension if, everybody's only Spanish speaking. So English speaking. Do you have any kind of suggestions for extension educators?
Well, I think it's a structural issue. I mean, when I talk about these kinds of matters, I criticize the additive model. That is, you keep the unit the same, the core activities, but then you add things to them. In this case, I would say that you have to transform the culture, the capacity, its capability, its priorities, all of those things. Otherwise, you're just doing the adding on, and that never works.
I would add that there are some things you can do, and it's hard to do this kind of stuff by yourself. And so in Missouri, the folks that were the most effective at that were working with we had a couple people that speak Spanish, but we had a number of resources with people that didn't speak Spanish, and that's what the farmers really needed access to. And so it's really kind of connecting people together and being creative in terms of how you get resources into people's hands. And so, and that's really hard to do given some of the structural issues that Ruben talks about, because in extension, most of the people I know are already working, full time on a lot of different things, and trying to add a whole new framework is difficult unless we create space for that to happen. And I think that's real important to do. Resources in Spanish is real important, but I think having it's all about relationships in terms of having much success. And so thinking creatively about how you can do that. I think English speaking extension folks can work with Spanish speaking extension folks. They're just going to need partners to help them work that out. And it could be local.
I think one of the other things is finding the spaces where Latinos relate that tend to be bilingual, actually, that can facilitate processes of providing information. Now, many of the farmers wanted the next generation, meaning their kids, to be engaged in farming, and they do speak English. So figuring out events and strategies that involved the youth is also important.
And the other part is really understanding that these farmers don't really understand what extension can do for them. And it can sometimes take a number of different efforts before they start to realize that the extension educators can be really helpful resource. And then once they understand that, they'll do what they can to make sure that they can get your resource in a form that they can use it. But it's kind of a both ends having to work together on that. Once they understand what you can do, they'll look for folks that can translate for them if they need to. Or we also in extension have to be looking all the time at how we can improve our ability to communicate with diverse groups, because it isn't just Spanish, and it's a number of different languages out there now.
And I would add that in the survey that I did of extension educators a few years ago, about 2/3 to 3/4 of the respondents, which was considerable. We had over 750 some respondents. About 2/3 to 3/4 of them wanted to work with Latino farmers.
Yeah.
They just don't see that their unit is prioritizing it, not providing the resources and so forth. And that's why I say, I mean, the unit needs to be transformed. Otherwise, it's not going to work. We need some transformational practices going on in the units, because you're not going to, the one person who wants to do it but isn't supported by the unit is not going to be able to be effective. And the scale of need out there is much greater than, the willingness of a few here and there who are willing to step out.
Great. These are great recommendations. In the interest of time, I'm going to allow one last question, if you all are okay. Emma, I see you have your video on, so I'll call on you to unmute yourself and ask your question. And that can be the last question of our webinar. This has been fantastic discussion. Obviously, it does show a need for continued discussion on this topic.
Gracias a todos. Thanks so much, Maria. My name's Emma Galasalini. I'm a brand new postdoc at Michigan State, but was wondering if anyone from any of the field sites saw a particular interest in alternative and even informal markets or seed exchange networks for some of these crops, or future aspirations toward that.
What I saw was that the informal market was sort of a default, because they can't get into these other markets. I mean, they don't, like in blueberries, they don't contract before the season and so on. So sometimes they just have to fall back on informal markets and roadside stands and so on. So they're just, they adapt to whatever challenges they experience, and they don't have a whole lot of resources to leverage that adaptation process.
I'm muted, of course. I know there were some other questions in the chat, but about livestock and stuff like that. So I think that you all would be open for somebody if they wanted more information about your study for them
Yeah.
to email you. So I will cut it off at that, I guess, and encourage you to come to our next webinar. As you can see, we have fantastic presenters and great topics. And I think we were going to have a last slide that had our webinar. So now I'm the one caught short-footed on knowing what the next webinar is. Thank you, Shelley. Our next webinar is All of Us Research Program, The Future of Health Starts With You. And that's actually working with HHS, and it's for mainly researchers and how you can use the data about getting people to put in their biometric information and use that for research. But that should be an interesting topic. Thank you, guys. This was fantastic. And I know people have to jump off, but I will give you a sounding applause for this great webinar. We really appreciate it. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Gracias.
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 Bye.